We're now going to read the Bible together. So if anyone would like one of the Bibles from here, you just need to put your hand up and someone will pop one round to you. Tonight's Bible reading is from Mark. We're going to read from Mark chapter 14, verses 53 to 72. And on the visitors' Bibles we have here, that's page 903. So Mark chapter 14, verse 53 to 72. They led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes assembled. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the high priest's courtyard. He was sitting with the servants, warming himself by the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they could not find any. For many were giving false testimony against him, and the testimonies did not agree. Some stood up and gave false testimonies against him, stating, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made by hands.' Yet their testimony did not agree even on this." Then the high priest stood up before them all and questioned Jesus. "Don't you have an answer to what these men are testifying against you?" But he kept silent and did not answer. Again, the high priest questioned him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What is your decision?" They all condemned him as deserving death. Then some began to spit on him, to blindfold him and beat him, saying, Prophesy. The temple servants also took him and slapped him. While Peter was in the courtyard below, one of the high priest's maidservants came. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." But he denied it. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about." Then he went out to the entryway and a rooster crowed. When the maidservant saw him again, she began to tell those standing by, "This man is one of them." But again he denied it. After a while, those standing there said to Peter again, "You certainly are one of them, since you're also a Galilean." Then he started to curse and swear, "I don't know this man you're talking about." Immediately a rooster crowed a second time, and Peter remembered when Jesus had spoken the word to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept.
Thanks very much, Sonia. Good evening again, everyone. It's good for us to keep working through the last week of Jesus' life, the week that changed the world. And you'll remember last week, if you were here or you've watched it, I started with this story or this illustration from the ads about superannuation, comparing the pair, and how in the passage last week, Mark's technique was to compare the strength of Jesus with the weakness of the disciples. In the face of temptation, we saw that we are weak, but Jesus is strong. And if it was possible for Bible chapters to be turned into movie series, we really ought to have seen last week a "to be continued" sign flash on the screen, because what we've read tonight is very much a continuation of what started last week. Mark is continuing to present this contrast between Jesus and the disciples, so that the unique faithfulness of Jesus will be emphasised, and our great need for Jesus and his faithfulness will be felt deeply. And one particular type of temptation that we all face in our weakness, and one in which we differ considerably from Jesus himself, is when we're faced with hostility, when when there's social pressure to distance ourselves from Jesus and the truths of the Bible. And what we're going to learn tonight is that faced with hostility, we are scared, but Jesus is brave. I do want to issue a brief qualification in light of last week and again in light of tonight. What we're seeing in these chapters is Mark's deliberate strategy to show us how unique Jesus is and why it is that we need him, that he is the only one that's perfectly obedient and eligible to go to the cross. And we, by contrast, are unfaithful and needy of Jesus' perfect life. One thing I've reflected on during the past week is it's not my intention for people to come away rejoicing in their weakness or feeling defeated, thinking, oh, we'll always be weak. And likewise tonight, we'll always be scared in the face of hostility. But do hear that reminded. Mark's technique is to put that before us so that we would see Jesus' uniqueness clearly and understand our particular need clearly. And so faced with hostility, we are scared, but Jesus is brave. And we see that truth unfold using the sandwich structure I introduced several weeks ago. You might remember back in chapter 11, we explained the sandwich structure to Mark's writing style. He starts with one scene and then looks at another scene, then comes back to the original scene. And that's the case here. We start with Peter in the courtyard, verse 54, and then we see Jesus before the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the peak body of Jewish rulers and leaders under the authority of the Romans. The Sanhedrin was comprised of priests and scribes and Pharisees, and they had the responsibility of overseeing and administering all the religious and cultural affairs of the Jewish people with the permission of the Romans. So they were a bit like our parliament or our court system, but obviously for first century Israel. Jesus is interrogated by the Sanhedrin, and then we come back to Peter in the courtyard. And all these things took place in close proximity to one another. After Jesus was arrested, at the end of the last passage, he was taken to the house of the high priest, which would have been a fairly large complex with a big room. I mean, that image is our best guess. A big sort of room where the Sanhedrin would have met, and then outside in the sort of the premises, a courtyard. So Peter and Jesus were very close to one another, and they're both being interrogated at the same time. And that's where the contrast emerges. So, beginning with us, I think we ought to see ourselves in the example of Peter. Even though it's second in the passage, we're going to start with him. As Jesus is being interrogated by the Sanhedrin, Peter is outside in the courtyard. You can see there in verse 66. And situated in the courtyard were a range of other people, not high on the social list, maidservants and other kind of helpers. And Jesus is being questioned by them. Verse 67. When one particular maidservant saw Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." And of course, we know Peter denied it. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about." He walks out to the entryway and a rooster crows. The first crow of the rooster ought to have triggered a response from Peter. Earlier in the evening, Jesus had said, "Before the rooster crows a second time, you will deny me 3 times." There's no doubt Peter would have heard it. He ought to have remembered Jesus' words and strengthened his resolve to stand by Jesus as he had promised with such conviction early in the evening. But the questions keep coming. A second time and then a third time. And his response escalates from one of, ambiguous denial. "I don't really know what you're talking about." Escalates from that level to a clear, unambiguous, forceful rejection. verse 71, he started to curse and swear. I don't know this man that you're talking about. Peter clearly and deliberately denied that he knew Jesus and was one of his followers. After all that he'd been through with him for 3 years, after earlier in the evening promising that he would go to his death with him, here he is, questioned by a few of the high priest's servants, denying it. Perhaps he was afraid of being arrested like Jesus. We're not sure. Clearly, he understood that the majority of people were opposed to Jesus, or the leaders at least, and there would be a cost to pay if he was found to be publicly aligned with him. We're similar to Peter in many ways, faced with social pressure when it comes to being aligned with Jesus and biblical Christianity, pressure which makes us feel nervous about being public with our Christian faith, our involvement in church, our particular convictions on moral or ethical issues. I think we all experience a lingering uneasiness about what might happen if we're completely honest with the people around us, whether that's our friends, our work colleagues, whoever it might be. And it's not always the case. In fact, it's rarely the case that, like Peter, we'll issue an outright denial when someone questions us. What tends to happen more often, at least in my experience, is that we'll be selective about what we share about ourselves. We'll find ways to keep our head under the parapet, not draw attention to ourselves, and even as opportunities and questions arise, we'll massage our responses in a way to avoid any real conflict or hostility. I remember when I was a younger man, about 21, 22, during uni, I was working part-time at a law firm. I was studying law, and I worked this place a couple of days a week. And on a Friday afternoon, just saying goodbye to a few people as the week finished, I had plans that weekend to go up to one of the Christian conferences at Katoomba. Some of you will know the big conference facility up there. And that was in the diary. That was the plan. And one fellow, another colleague, someone slightly more senior than me, but by no means the boss, said, have a good weekend. What are you up to? And I said, heading up to the Blue Mountains with some friends. I wasn't game for some reason to be completely candid about what I was doing. Maybe I was worried about what they would think of me. Would they, tease me, think less of me, think I'm some crazy weirdo? This fellow pressed me. Oh, that's great. I love the Blue Mountains. What are you going to get up to up there? And again, my answers remained deliberately general. Just hang out with my friends, do what you do in the Blue Mountains. I was committed not to sharing the complete truth with this fellow about my plans to go to a Christian conference and obviously hear from the Bible and spend time thinking about God and Jesus and all that stuff. In hindsight, I really don't know why I did that. But as I left the building that evening, I was convicted that I had been untruthful. Technically speaking, I hadn't told a lie, but I knew in my heart that I was ashamed. I demonstrated shame for being associated with Jesus and biblical Christianity. I really don't know why I did that, but I remember it quite well, and I feel guilty. I felt guilty about it. What if you've ever had an experience like that, withholding the truth about your Christian faith in order to keep the peace? These days, it's not always about, our Christian faith or our allegiance to Jesus, our attendance at church that ruffles feathers. more often than not, it's the implications of Christian faith that cause controversy and make people feel uncomfortable. The implication that Jesus is the only way to heaven and that the other religions are false. The implication that the Bible has for one's view of marriage or sexuality or gender or all manner of ethical issues. That's where the hostility tends to emerge, and that's where we find ourselves tested. Will we publicly align ourselves with Jesus and his teachings or not? There's a very good book called Being the Bad Guys. I'm not sure if some of you may have heard of it. It's talking about us, talking about Christian people. And the point of this book is to show us and I guess remind us that the world has changed. Perhaps 50 years ago, Christian values and positions on different moral issues were fairly mainstream and aligned with the population at large. And so to be a Christian or to have a particular view on a particular ethical matter didn't generally cause too much controversy. But these days, because of those issues and because our culture has evolved so much, Christians are not only seen as neutral or irrelevant, we're seen as harmful, as the bigoted bad guys or gals whose views ought to be condemned and restrained. I've got no doubt that in your various circumstances, whether in your workplaces, amongst your social groups, at the school gate, you have felt the tension of whether or not you ought to be completely transparent about your views. People think of us as the bad guys. So in many respects, we find ourselves in exactly the kind of situation Peter found ourselves in here, tested as to whether we will be publicly loyal to Jesus or not. And often, as my example demonstrates, we're scared and we fail that test. And it's an indictment on the fact that we value our personal comfort and our social standing more than we value Jesus. Faced with hostility, we are scared, but Jesus is brave. And let me reissue my clarification. There are many times that we exhibit courage and aren't scared in the kind of way I described in my story or the way we see in Peter here. God strengthens us by his Holy Spirit. If you're sitting here thinking, oh, I don't really resonate with what you're saying here, I'm quite confident, know that if you do fail, you're just like Peter. Later in the story of the Gospels, we see Peter being restored to his position of leadership in the church, which is a wonderful grace because Jesus is brave when we are scared, and it's his bravery that leads him to the cross and enables him to issue that forgiveness. So on to the second point, where we are scared, Jesus is brave. Skim back to the first half of the passage. In the room adjacent to the courtyard, where Peter was being interrogated, Jesus was facing an interrogation of a different type, facing the Sanhedrin, a large group of accomplished and well-respected leaders of the community, somewhat more fearsome than the maidservants in the courtyard. These leaders, as we read, had already decided that Jesus was guilty and wanted to put him to death. Verse 55. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death. As I said earlier, the Sanhedrin operated under the authority of the Roman government, and the Sanhedrin didn't have the permission to sentence people to death. It was one of the limitations on their power. So they needed to formulate a charge uh, that was suitable for execution, and they had to provide evidence for that charge so that Jesus could be found guilty. And this is precisely what their aim is here. It's not a mistake, it's a deliberate sham. Even with those sort of manipulative intent in mind, they still found it difficult. Look at verse 56. People were giving false testimonies, but the testimonies did not agree. And that point's reiterated in verse 59. People were coming, scoundrels, hoping maybe to get a quick buck to say something that would see Jesus condemned. But even then, their testimony didn't agree. Mark's point is unmistakable. It's the leaders who are guilty and Jesus is innocent, not the other way around. I wonder, has anyone seen the movie Hurricane, starring Denzel Washington? This whole scene reminds me of a story of an American boxer from the 50s and 60s. There's a tremendous song by Bob Dylan called Hurricane. I recommend you jump on Spotify and listen to it. Anyone know it? Don't be ashamed. Yes. Respect. The story of Reuben Carter, who was a successful boxer in the 60s, who was wrongfully investigated and convicted of a murder that took place in a bar in New Jersey, a part of the United States. And as you read his story, whether, on the internet, watch the movie, in the song, it's infuriating because it becomes clear that even though this fellow was not guilty of the crime, the racist police and judicial system that oversaw this process found a way to convict him, not once, but twice, of a murder which he never did. And he spent, I think, roughly 20 years in jail for a crime that he never committed. And I'm sure you can probably think of other examples of wrongful convictions, of grievous injustices, mistrials. It's infuriating when we see such a mistake with such consequences unfold. We long for justice, and we hate it when justice is miscarried in such an obvious and deliberate way. And that's exactly what's happening here in the Sanhedrin. And our natural inclination in the face of such injustice is to defend ourselves, to speak up, to provide the truth that's necessary to clear our name. Jesus, on the other hand, doesn't do that. In the face of all these false testimonies, he remains silent. Look at verse 61. The high priest has become frustrated and says, don't you have an answer to what these men are testifying against you? But he kept silent and did not answer. This particular verse reminds us of Isaiah's prophecy in chapter 53, speaking of the suffering that the suffering servant would endure to save people from their sin. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb led to the slaughter, and like a sheep silent before her shearers, he did not open his mouth. I can't imagine the strength of character and resolve that Jesus possessed to remain silent in the face of such outrageous and false accusations. But he did. Because in the face of hostility, Jesus was brave where we might be scared. Faced with temptation, Jesus is strong where we're often weak. But things change in the second half of verse 61. The high priest, probably infuriated by this stage, asked Jesus directly, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One. Often in Mark's Gospel, you may remember when a particular person, someone that's been healed or seen one of Jesus' miracles, if they come to realise that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, often he'll tell them to keep it quiet, won't he? And it seems odd to us when we read those passages. The reason for that is that Jesus didn't want the climax of his mission to arrive too early, that the crowds wouldn't, gather and condemn him before he's had opportunity to complete his ministry. And any time you read one of those particular verses, it just feels very odd that Jesus would not want people to publicly spread the news that he is the Messiah. But that changes now. That changes. Asked directly, "Are you the Messiah, the Blessed One?" Jesus says, "I am. I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Have you ever heard a skeptic say to you, "Oh, Jesus never really claimed to be God. You know, it's really just a myth that evolved from his followers in the following centuries"? I've heard that before. It's a common technique for people that don't want to deal seriously with the claims that Jesus makes. "Oh, he never really claimed to be God." Well, clearly he did. Here he is on responding to the high priest, answering his question directly. "I am the Messiah. I am the Son of God." And the words he used come from different parts of the Old Testament. Being seated at the right hand of God is an allusion to Psalm 110. But Daniel 7 is an incredibly important passage where Jesus draws the Son of Man title from. Daniel, one of the Old Testament prophets, had got a range of visions that God gave him about the end times. And in one vision, he sees one like a son of man who was coming with the clouds of heaven, who approaches God and is given a kingdom that will never pass away. We'll come back to this verse in a moment. But Jesus' point here is crystal clear. I am the promised Messiah and God's appointed King. I imagine it would have taken immense courage for Jesus to speak of his identity so clearly, because he would have known the consequences that would follow. And as we read on, the high priest tore his robes, and the consequences that Jesus expected followed, of course. They condemned him to death and ushered him into Pontius Pilate, which we'll come to next week. Jesus was brave where we are weak, interrogated, faced with real consequences. He did not shirk his responsibility. But of course, it's not a mistake. None of this is a mistake, like the wrongful convictions of history that frustrate us. Jesus told his disciples several times, didn't he, that he would be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes and suffer. At the meal earlier in the evening, Jesus said that his blood would be poured out for the new covenant. And when he was arrested, in the passage that we read last week, Jesus said the scriptures must be fulfilled. And here we see Jesus faithfully demonstrating the strength and the bravery that we never could. And his faithfulness in going to the cross made forgiveness and restoration for Peter possible, just as it makes it possible for us. And of course, we now live in a different era to Peter, given all manner of reason to trust Jesus in the face of hostility. I said earlier, though we're weak and scared, we need not be ruled by our weakness or our fear. Mark's point in this passage is to highlight Jesus' strength and bravery and to contrast it with Peter's weakness and lack of courage. But now that Jesus is risen, we have every reason to align ourselves with him publicly, with confidence and assurance, later in that Daniel passage, we read of Jesus, his dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed. If I had read a verse like this the morning I encountered my colleague back in that law firm 15 to 20 years ago, I wonder if my approach would have been different. Confident and assured that the king I belong to is the only king of the world, and I need not fear any consequence, big or little, for aligning myself with him, for being truthful in my confession rather than ashamed. Jesus' kingdom is one that will not be destroyed. There's no power, there's no person, there's no government, there's no authority, there's no movement on this planet that ought to worry us, because his dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away. So take heart. If you fail like Peter, there's forgiveness. But we have every reason to be confident and to follow in Jesus' footsteps with bravery rather than being scared, with strength rather than weakness. When I pray for help that we do just that. Heavenly Father, we're sorry for the times that we are weak rather than strong. We're sorry for the times that in the face of hostility, we're scared rather than being brave. We praise and thank you in particular that Jesus was brave and strong in the face of hostility and ultimately went to the cross for our sake so that we could have peace with you, and our weakness and our lack of bravery wouldn't be counted against us. Help us to live with courage and confidence, knowing that if we're called to publicly identify ourselves with Jesus or to express our views on biblical matters of ethics or all kinds of issues, help us to have confidence that speaking the truth and being aligned to Jesus is always the right choice, and that none of the consequences that we might face in this life can take away our eternal place in your kingdom. We pray all these things in Jesus' name.